for 2021, or whether you're just one of our YouTube live viewers, welcome. MedTech Innovator is an accelerator for medical technology. We cover everything except for pharmaceuticals. Our sectors are medical device, diagnostics, digital health, and life science tools. And what we do at MedTech Innovator is we try to find the most compelling companies all over the world each year and connect them with the world's best ecosystem for success. And by success, I mean bringing technologies to patients and with the maximum value in doing so. And for those of you who are healthcare entrepreneurs, you'll know what I mean. A critical part of this process is raising capital. And capital raising starts usually with some friends and family, co-founders, people like that. And then you evolve through a process. And the investors you choose, the structure you choose, all those things can impact your company, whether or not your technology is good or bad, whether or not your clinical data is promising. You choose the wrong investors, you choose the wrong structure, and it really can impact your company both positively and negatively. And we've seen in our experience with well over 6,000 companies that we've looked at MedTech Innovator, and my career previously as an investor looking at tens of thousands of companies, I can tell you that those wrong choices in who your investors are will absolutely sink your company. We'll get into some of those details as we go, but today I'm really excited to have a panel of three great investors, three people who are the kinds of people I'm talking about who really can add value and represent different assets, different aspects as well of the investor landscape. Everything from angel to institutional VC, corporate VC. So we'll have some great different perspectives today. So with that, let me introduce today's panelists. I'm going to start off with Tom. So Tom, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background as an individual, the company you work for, and then also tell us a little bit about maybe a little bit about your focus in particular at Dexcom Ventures. So Tom.
Great. Good morning. Thanks, Paul, very much. And it's nice to be on with everyone and my fellow panelists. So background-wise, I'm a physician healthcare executive by background and training. I'm actually a gastroenterologist. I spent about 20 years in an academic career along with a healthcare leadership career where I basically was doing large physician group leadership. Was a person who did a lot of entrepreneurship within the walls of kind of traditional bricks and mortar healthcare, and then made a transition to join Arboretum Ventures about 8 years ago. So I'm now one of the 4 managing partners at Arboretum. We are an Ann Arbor, Michigan-based healthcare-only venture capital firm. And I'll just tell you that we invest in all the verticals Paul mentioned. In other words, we invest across the landscape of healthcare minus biotech and pharma. Most traditionally, we are really proud of our MedTech roots. So we do devices and diagnostics are about 60% of our investments historically. We invest typically in Series A and B is 65% of our investments are Series A or B. We'll do some later stage, we'll also do some earlier stage. And we're currently investing out of a $250 million fund, $700 million of assets under management in total. So we've been around since 2003. And I think our guiding star, which is important for us, is we invest in capital efficient companies that drive the costs out of healthcare, the healthcare system, while improving healthcare quality. So unlike a lot of folks who caught on to healthcare spend, it's been part of the DNA, which I think at Arboretum has been a real advantage for us. And then I think we've really benefited from being off the coast. 65 to 70% of our historical investments are outside of San Francisco, New York, and Boston. So we certainly will go there. We'll do great deals, but we really like to look for deals in the underventured parts of the country as well.
That's a great intro, a great background. I love that you're off the coast. We always like to say that innovation is everywhere. It's not just in Silicon Valley and Boston. And the companies that we find every year, the ones that oftentimes are the most exciting, are ones that are in other ecosystems that typically don't have really experienced healthcare investors. So it's great that you're there in Michigan and they're leading that charge. So thank you, Tom. All right, so let's move on next to Ann DeGeest at Health Tech Capital. So Ann, again, tell us about yourself, your background and Health Tech Capital and where you focus.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for inviting us and setting this up. So my background is that, as you're probably going to try to guess by now, is that I'm originally from Belgium. So that's that little French twist you're hearing. I started my career at a company called Nelcor, launched pulse oximetry, and really developed this health tech sector 35 years ago by combining the knowledge I had in the computer and technology, which was my engineering background, and then problems in healthcare. And really was lucky enough to get 8 IPOs and multiple exits. My frustration, it was extremely difficult to raise money for that young sector. So in 2010, I started Health Tech Capital, which is a very unique organization. We're a membership organization where 2/3 of our members are accredited investors across the US. So although we're based in Silicon Valley, we invest everywhere in the US. But we also have VCs members as well as corporate VCs. And that gave us a huge access to expertise for our portfolio company there, and as well as the introduction of a potential partnership on the corporate side. We have invested in 50 companies across the 5 buckets, which we'll talk later, which is who pays. And that could be direct to the patients, the providers, the payers, pharma, and the employers. We love to work early. So we're seed to Series A. We've just launched this week a virtual membership program there where we can help the company develop their first working prototype all the way to manufacturing, as well as helping them on the business strategy. So we really, we specialize in health tech. So we won't do what's called heavy FDA. So we won't do PMA and drugs or heavy diagnostics, but we will do what's called a smart 510K.
And since you just mentioned it, maybe you could tell us just a little bit more, not too long, but a little more about that new program you launched and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy for us as investors to say no because there's always something missing. And the seed stage, there's a lot of those holes. And so when we see something that's very promising with an entrepreneur that has a flexible mindset, so we can work very well with them, we will invest a small amount of money there, and then we'll surround them with 3 to 5 of our members that can bring that expertise that's missing in the team for 3 to 4 months, and then get them ready for Tom or Steve or some of the organized venture funds.
Terrific. Well, we're going to learn more about that, but certainly, from a stage perspective, you had a huge amount of value at the early stage. A lot of the MedTech Innovator alumni have been lucky enough to receive investments from Health Tech Capital.
Even one, Sana Health won.
That's right. One even won our global competition. That's right, Sana. So thank you. So, I know you had a huge amount of value from my personal experience in working with you over these years. So
thank you.
Great to have you here. Thank you, Anne. And then our third panelist for today, Steve Pacelli, who's with Dexcom Ventures. Steve, tell us again about yourself. Dexcom Ventures is a corporate venture capital fund, so it's a little bit different than the typical, or I should say, than a VC, a standard institutional VC. So maybe tell us not only just about yourselves, but also maybe some of the nuances related to why Dexcom is doing this and what you're looking for. In addition,
that's great. So thank you. As the other said, thank you for having us today. I've been a corporate executive at Dexcom. I'm in my 16th year here. I've held a number of positions. Most recently, I was the executive vice president of strategy and corporate development. The formation of Dexcom Ventures has actually been a long time dream of mine, and it was honestly, we've only been in existence for about 6 months now. Made my pitch to the board back in December and was blessed. They granted us a fund of $100 million, which is our first fund. But as you mentioned, Paul, we're structured a little bit differently. So I'm, for better or for worse, I'm beholden to one limited partner, which is Dexcom. For those of you who are not familiar with Dexcom, we're a medical device company focused on technologies for people with diabetes and glucose monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring. So as a corporate venture fund, we're not necessarily constrained in terms of, we talk about angel investing to seed investing to Series A, all the way through even later stage investments. We're not really constrained by kind of the size and timing of the investment. Where our constraints come in as a corporate investor is that we have to have some tie back to the core. And what I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily, so we're a diabetes technology company. It doesn't necessarily need to be diabetes, but it needs to be either, somehow related to diabetes. If it's an early stage company, it may actually be, or even some form of new sensing, maybe sensing new analytes or something like that. But it could be as early stage for us as really forming a company around some entrepreneurs and helping them get going and do some technology development. The tieback in an investment like that for us would obviously be, we would be looking to help someone develop technology with the goal of ultimately having Dexcom, the parent, either in-license the technology or ultimately purchase the technology, right? Maybe at an earlier stage. If you look out in our investment horizon, we participate or we look to participate in a maybe later stage investment, there's probably going to be some tie back to the core. So what we might be looking at is investing in a digital therapeutic or something that maybe we're in a market that we're not currently participating as Dexcom, where we would look to not only invest and help grow an earlier stage company, but also look to get our sensor technologies into their platform. So think maybe like a hospital to home platform, right? A remote patient monitoring platform, a digital therapeutic, something along those lines, where there would have to be some sort of tieback on the commercial, particularly in a later stage investment, some tieback to the commercial organization within Dexcom. So again, not exactly constrained by the timing in terms of early stage versus later stage, but there needs to be that, we at least have to pass the straight face test when we bring it back to the investment committee.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve. So great context. And it's great to understand, again, kind of some of those nuances when someone's thinking about approaching Dexcom, that they should be thinking about what the synergy is with Dexcom, and not just sending out something cold that's in a totally different sector and that you probably won't be applicable to. So good to know that. So thank you for that. And also the particular emphasis on things like sensors and digital and all that. So we'll talk more about that as we go. So those are our three panelists for today. As you see, really great diversity here. It's going to be really fun to have this discussion. So I want to start off by reminding everyone who's watching. So there's two different groups. There's some people watching this on YouTube Live. For you have a chat box on the right-hand side. You can post questions there. That'll make it to one of my team members who will alert me, and I'll try and ask those questions in this first hour if I can. And for all of our MedTech Innovator cohort, as always, please use the Q&A button here in Zoom to queue up your questions for our panelists. Those will be addressed in the 30-minute private session that we'll do after the live broadcast. And also, if you have any clarifying follow-up kinds of questions that you would like me to ask during the discussion in this first hour, put those into the chat. I'll be monitoring that as well. All right, so let's dig into some of the latest data. Rock Health, Startup Health, Silicon Valley Bank have just come out with their latest reports showing, the booming funding that's happening in healthcare. You can go to their websites and download those. We'll be talking to Silicon Valley Bank next week, as well as others about what's happening in the fundraising space and the M&A space. But let's talk a little bit about just a brief amount today about some of this data and what that maybe says about these different sectors. So we've got overall healthcare funding is way up, which is great for this year in the first half. In terms of the sectors, I know that health tech has a $14.6 billion in invested capital in the first half of 2021, which is really pretty incredible, followed by diagnostics and tools at $7.7 billion in funding, and then devices at $4.6 billion in funding. All of those are up. So these are all increases over prior years, and that's great for all of us. But certainly there's a big disparity between health tech, diagnostics, and devices. I know, Anne, in our prep call, when you talked about this as being this tale of three cities. So let me start off with you. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of funding trends in those three main sectors, and also, kind of any commentary you have just in general about how those sectors are doing. Is it strong? Are people struggling in certain sectors? Where are they struggling? So, and I'll go to each of the panelists for this, but let's start with you, Anne.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, it's really astonishing, the differences. So we put everything into healthcare, but it's really three different cities. So let's look about the gold rush, and that's the health tech sector. I mean, we have invested more in the first half of this year than all of last year. And I think it's a bit biased. If you do a deep dive on the data, what you see is that we have private equity who has moved to the later stage. So the size of the rounds have gone up drastically. The Series A has literally doubled from $10 million to $17 million. But what's very misleading is 59% of this $14 billion went into this massive Series C's and D's of $300 to $400 million round. So as early stage entrepreneurs, you have to still get a reality check. You are not at that stage where, I mean, it's really pre-IPO type of funding there. If you look at MedTech, there's still we're still recovering from the fact we lost 2/3 of a medical device investor in the last 10 years when the FDA was a bit difficult to work with. And so we still have a good money available for the seed and the angel rounds. I still see a gap in the Series A and B as long as the FDA is still a risk and you haven't fully figured out the business models, if there's some issue on reimbursement right now. We see a lot of people waiting on medical devices after you have decreased this risk there, but there's still a gap to get to that. So I think you have to really have a different pathway in the funding if you're traditional medical device versus health tech. And I think diagnostics still has the big T problem, which is the Theranos overhang, which is, is there a real business here? What's the exit? There still hasn't been that many success stories. So these are very, very different sectors there. So don't be fooled by the big numbers there. Unless you're raising $5 million in a Series D, that's not going to affect you as much. It is create a problem, and I'll let the other panelists comment on this too, where the valuation gets too high. And then the company cannot get into that valuation, and the runway has decreased from 18 months, which is what it took you to decrease the risk in getting milestones, to 9 months. And in 9 months, you still have a 2-year selling cycle to the payers and the providers. So you may end up having a bridge to nowhere, where you basically get this wonderful valuation, you have bragging rights, and then you cannot get to the next round because your runway is too short. And I'd love to get the feedback from Tom and Steve on that.
Yeah, and Tom and Steve, please jump in. We have a lot of things to unpack in that opening there about valuations, about runway, about all sorts of things. So why don't we move on to Tom?
Yeah. So Paul, thank you. So Anne, I couldn't agree with your comments more. I think it is not only a tale of three cities, but I think Anne brings up a great point that maybe I'll just spend a little bit more time on, which is, egos and valuation are often linked way too tightly. And I think that there's a very, very frothy nature right now to what's going on in healthcare investing. And some of it is pent-up demand, some of it is excess capital, some of it is the post-COVID effect or the ongoing COVID effect. But I think for early stage, whether you're in any of those buckets, I think Anne's comment is right on, right? You need to have a reality check. And it may not be you and your co-founder, it may need to be some advisor who allows you to play devil's advocate and you'll listen. Because I think right now, I want to really emphasize Anne's point, which is taking in either too much capital or taking in capital with too short a runway or taking in capital that puts you at a valuation that you can't possibly get an up round for, sets you up for three different types of disasters. And so I think that there needs to be, the question that gets used a lot, or the term that gets used, is smart money versus dumb money. And I won't quantify where that money comes into. But the idea right now of comparing yourself to somebody who's in tech or someone who's in health tech, if you're a med device entrepreneur, and thinking that you need a certain valuation, I think that's a really harmful thing for folks. And I believe we're going to have a tremendous day of reckoning in our market over the next couple of years, whenever the correction is, in a couple areas. One of them is going to be in valuation. The other thing that's interesting, we don't have to get into now, is going to be folks who went out in a SPAC and maybe they should have never gone out as early as they did. So on some of the bad SPACs, and I think we're in for some potentially bumpy sledding 24 to 36 months and maybe sooner, based on some of what I would say the heady excitement people have right now across the valuation spectrum.
Yeah, no, really, really good points. Again, we can unpack some of these things even in more detail. I think we're going to talk about SPACs again in a subsequent webinar in more detail. But you're right. I've seen the same thing all over the place. I'm seeing people setting valuations that they cannot possibly justify on that next round, or certainly not with a large uptick that their investors would like to see, to justify why you should get in early and take more risk, when you could just say, well, if that's your valuation, I'll sit back and wait until later when you can justify that. So it's definitely potentially causing some problems. We'll talk in a little bit more about early investments and the way to structure them. But I want to move on to Steve here for a moment and say, one of the things that or talk about this topic a little bit, which is that a lot of times in the past, people would say, well, I'm going to go to corporate because they'll give us a better valuation, or, they won't be as valuation sensitive. We're going to talk in detail about valuation, but I'm just curious, does that, in your experience, in the way you're thinking, would you say that's still current, or is that outdated thinking?
It's actually a valid. So I hate to belabor the valuation point, but you're going to hear it from the three of us throughout the entire presentation, because we all, I think, agree that valuations have gotten a little frothy. So a couple of things. One of the beauties about being a corporate venture capitalist and really looking for that strategic element is that we're not necessarily as valuation sensitive. The caveat to that, though, is we typically won't be the lead investor in a round. If we talk really early stage, like I mentioned, if we're going to do like a company formation, we may take the whole thing. And honestly, that might not even happen at the Dexcom Ventures level. That may happen at the parent company level, kind of outside of our venture fund. But what I would typically look to do is rely on a more established, more traditional VC who is beholden to their limited partners, who is going to beat the company up on valuation. And then we'll come in and be probably less sensitive. We've made a couple of investments to date, one of which I still believe the valuation was a little too frothy, but we had a really solid syndicate of investors around the table, and they signed up to the valuation. It was a very strategic deal for us from a commercial perspective. And so we were willing to follow along. So it's a little bit, we're just in a little bit different position there, because look, we're not in this, Dexcom Ventures is not in this to lose money by any stretch, right? I won't have a job by 2 years, 3 years from now if I don't have some liquidity. But at the same time, for us, I'm going to be measured as much. We're going to be measured as a venture firm. If we end up licensing technology or acquiring some technology, even if it were in a down round, if it were down from the last valuation, that's probably actually a win for the company, for the parent company. So that doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on us. We found a technology that was valuable to the parent. We went out and acquired it, whether even if the parent paid too much or too little, it doesn't really matter. So we are probably still a little bit less valuation sensitive, but I know we're going to talk about SPACs. I do worry for those of you around the table listening that there are too many SPACs out there, and there are going to be too many deals that end up public that should not be public. And we've been a public company. I've been at Dexcom since shortly after our IPO in 2005. And we had some tough days, and we had already had a product. The FDA approved it shortly after the IPO, and we were commercial. And even with real revenues and a real technology that was FDA PMA approved at the time, it was a tough slog being a public company. So I would caution you all on rushing to try to get yourself public via a SPAC, because you're going to be approached by SPACs. There's too much money in the market right now. There have been too many SPACs formed. The founders of the SPACs make all the cash in these things anyway. I'd just be really cautious about going down that path.
Yeah, the founders in the SPACs being people who create the SPAC.
That's correct.
They do well no matter what.
Sponsors is what they're
sponsors, exactly. Yeah. The sponsor of the SPAC makes money, whether the company makes money.
Which is why they're such a popular vehicle for the sponsor.
Yeah, it sure is. All right. Well, we're not going to get too much into SPACs. So let's just talk just a little bit more now. Before we get into, I want to talk more about valuations, but I want to back up a little bit here and talk about just investments in general. So some of the characteristics that make for a compelling investment, which is going to be different maybe for the three of you. And we talked a little bit about that already, but in general, what are some of the characteristics each of you look for in a compelling investment, and maybe even, using a deal that you've done recently? You can name it or not name the company, but just tell us kind of what excited you about that investment. So I'm going to start with Tom this time.
So Paul, there's a number we could talk about, but I think I'll give you one that, we've at Arboretum, particularly on the med device and diagnostic side, have really always liked faster, smaller, cheaper, or more efficient, something that is a rapid follower. So we made an investment in a company in Northern California this year called Koya Medical. So Koya is in the lymphedema space. So very briefly for everyone, folks who've had damage to their lymph nodes, either from radiation or, for instance, classic is a woman who has a breast cancer and has lymph node dissection. The fluid ends up remaining static in the limb. And so they have one limb that is very, very swollen. Over time, that can lead to significant damage, a disease called lymphedema. And there have been a number of treatments over the years that were actually massage-based that have become automated. And so Koya is a company that is I would say, rapid follower to a public company called Tactile. So Tactile has a wearable sleeve that actually does the massage for the patient, but the patient is tethered to the machine. And so the innovation at Koya was a different form factor in order to stimulate the fluids movement from down in the arm up to the central blood system, but doing it in a way that was comfortable and more mobile for the patient. So it is a faster, more efficient, more patient-friendly version of a company. One that we're excited about because a huge impact to impact the lives of these patients. But I think just a couple of comments about why we found it so interesting. Terrific founder who surrounded himself with an excellent team. Actually, they are a MedTech Innovator graduate, so I just called that out. So they had folks around them to give them good advice. The first time we saw the company, we weren't ready. There wasn't enough data, so we didn't do the round, but we followed closely. And if you look at our investments, roughly 2/3 of them we didn't do the first time we met the team and the CEO. We waited for them to mature or the company to mature a little bit, or they hit a milestone. And when Andy and his team were able to do that, we came in and led the Series A for them. So I think the characteristics we really like: dynamic team, very large market. When we talk about valuation, and folks wonder, where does my company fit? When you have a competitor out there who's doing what you're doing, you can extrapolate a little bit in terms of what ultimate value might be. That can be helpful in terms of providing some insight. And I think, big market, and then a very patient-centric technology, right? It was built around what would the patient want, as opposed to what can I build and then tell the patient they have to use. And so I think it's one that it's a number of characteristics that we find appealing, and is a company we're excited to watch as they move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for calling out Koya. We're huge fans of Andy and the team there and the technology, and some really good comments that you gave in terms of what the compelling aspects are. I think I'm going to do a follow-up where I'm going to put those on the screen next to you because I love them. That's good. Thanks, Tom. Maybe the others, Ann and Steve, you could comment as well on what Tom just said, and if you agree, and if there are other ones that you think make for compelling investments. So Ann, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, Paul. And so we are earlier investor than Tom is. So we are looking at the risk, and we're looking at risk differently depending on the three sectors. So I'm going to kind of give you 3 examples. We closed 3 deals this month, so we've been really busy. And so we look at deals for what's the market risk, what's the unmet need, is it big, what's the payment system there, what's the product, does it work, is it protectable, a regulatory risk, the team risk, which is always an issue in the early stage, and then the funding risk, which we talk about, is there money coming after us? So I'll give you an example. So we have one medical devices there, and the reason why we jumped in on that one, and it's still stealth, so I can't give you the name, but it's a top CEO who has done this before, and he has a track record of getting exit. And also we have a leading physicians there that has a big name, and it's a new devices to do new procedures in the bariatric space. And so we've jumped on it because we could say, hey, low risk on the team and the product, therefore they'll figure out the FDA and the market creation there because they've done this before. And then we're doing another one, which we follow for 2 years. It's a company called Xcure that's in the digital pharma space. So it's an AI play for the oncology space. In their case, we says, you need to get to an inflection point to really make it. And so he says, come back and get a pharma lead, which they did. And then we participate in a $10 million round. So in that specific case, we had that specific concern that they need to get the critical mass to show the value proposition. So we look at the market risk to be the big problem there. And then the third one we just did is a digital pathology deal called Aquar. And that was interesting in that one is that we are the first smart medical healthcare investor. And because we didn't invest a lot of money, there was a deluge of tech investors that came in. So they literally doubled the size of their A round to, I think it'll be too high, but we'll see what happens there. So we in each cases there, we look at the different risk and we behave differently depending on the space. And I think that's something the entrepreneurs in the room need to understand, that there is not one formula in health tech. The way we investors look at medical devices versus the digital pathology, for example, and versus an AI health tech play is very different. And we're going to basically make bets based on how we evaluate product risk, market risk, team risk, FDA risk, and a funding risk, which I think is really a big issue for us as Angel on the medical device side. Is there money coming behind us? What's the milestones they have to get to so that Tom can be interested?
That's a good point. And, and I think in both Tom and Ann, you mentioned that idea that you're meeting companies early, developing a relationship, following them over time. And it's not necessarily that you pass and therefore you're not interested. And, or that you're not, or that you've said that, this round isn't going to be a fit or it's too early or whatever you tell the person. But I think that's really important for people to understand. These deals take years to mature. And relationships, and there's definitely a cycle and a pace that you need to be aware of, and not to expect that everyone's just going to say yes the first time, or you should write them off.
Yeah, I think the key point to get across, Paul, is that what will it take with this funding you're trying to get now to get you to the next funding? And are your assumptions realistic? And then each sector is different. What's the risk you have to lower to get the bigger VCs to get invested? And that's the key work that I think the entrepreneur, the MedTech innovator, has to work with you, because that makes or break the first round of funding.
Right. The next investor and what milestones they need to see. Right. Okay. And Steve, any other comments you want to make on this?
Yeah, no, it was hit on a little bit by Tom, but I think, obviously the same comments, right? Disruptive technology, IP, protectable IP is really important for us. We spend a lot of time evaluating a company's IP portfolio, or what, at least what's in the pipeline. But I think the one thing I would want to emphasize is really investing in the people, particularly early stage, because it's, and I'm sure the entrepreneurs on the call have heard this, right? The biggest fear if you're an entrepreneur is you get, bulge bracket venture capitalists in, and immediately you were the founder and CEO, now you're the CTO, and pretty soon you're not really with the company anymore. And that doesn't sit well with me. I actually much prefer, especially in the early stage, and it a little bit ties into what Ann's point was, is on the future fundability of the company. I want to make sure we're investing in a team that is, and the entrepreneurs are typically very committed. That isn't the problem. But you want to invest in a team that you believe in, and they don't always have to have done it before. That's another myth that I think we see out of the Silicon Valley, that the serial entrepreneur is always the most successful. I found that is not always the case. But find a team that you believe in, and that you believe that if you're going to fund it, particularly at an early stage, you'll be able to take that team and present them to the larger venture capital firms, and present them and get the thing funded going forward. I think that's important, and not have to be. No, you don't want to be investing in something knowing that you're going to be swapping out the CEO or the founders within the next 12 to 18 months. That just isn't the way we like to look at deals.
So that's an interesting point, Steve. So I know that early stage companies, the founders who were there in the very beginning, are not always the ideal management, and oftentimes these people get replaced. So Tom, when you look at a company, at the stage that you'll come in, do you look at a company and say, like, if they don't have the right team in place, we're not going to make the investment? Or at that point, are you potentially dropping in people that from past investments or have past experience with? Like, just tell me very briefly kind of about that and how you look at teams.
No, Paul, it's a great point. I think the answer is we will certainly make an investment where we may need to move or bring in a new talent or move somebody around. It's not what we do most of the time, but I think your point is it's rare for a founding CEO to be able to go the whole distance, or the founding team to be able to go the distance. We love it when it happens. Doesn't always happen. I think the key issue is we have really frank conversations with folks, right? I think the idea, and I have found with experience, that there are a lot of folks who realize they may be playing one level above where they're most comfortable. And as the company grows, they're more interested in being a contributor rather than kind of being in the role that they're in. So I think the answer is, when we look at a deal, we look at the team, we look at the team dynamics, we look at do you have the right person in the right seat? And that becomes a big thing for us. But again, when we bring in capital, we want to put the company in the best position for success. And so if we had very big personnel hesitancies, that may be something to give us pause. But otherwise, we realize we're in this in a long-term partnership with the management team, and there's going to be evolution and iteration and potential change. But we do it for the better. The beautiful part of alignment, right, is if we make the pie bigger and everybody has a big exit, everybody benefits from that. So I think there is some rowing the boat in the same direction around alignment in that setting.
Yeah, and I think what you said is so important, which is about having frank conversations telling people, hey, you may not be the right CEO after this round. We should all be considering that, or you're not the right CEO. Let's make a priority to do a search and find the person, but we love what you guys are doing, want to help you grow. Whatever it is, just be frank and honest. And I know a lot of investors do that, and I know a lot of investors don't have that honest conversation. One of our portfolio companies from years ago, I remember they had a later round happen and immediately booted the CEO and didn't give any heads up about that, which causes a lot of friction. And as you said, these are relationships you want to have for long term. And I know Arboretum has made investments in companies purely based on people you've worked with in the past, and are excited to have that entrepreneur back for another time. And so those relationships are really important.
And Paul, I'll just add one thing, because you asked in your initial question real briefly, just to finish, do we have folks that we have to backfill? So if you think about the PE model, right, where there's operating teams, that's not something we do. We certainly have backed the same CEO with new companies in the past, but the idea of having a cadre of folks out there to say, oh, this is a natural next CTO, it doesn't really work that way, right? The jobs are so specific that we don't have that model. However, as Ann said earlier, we're seeing PE folks come and playing earlier in the game. And those teams often have much more kind of classical operators they can pop in if need to. So I just wanted to make that to close the loop on that question.
Yeah, Paul, I'd like to make a comment for the early stage. There's no way at the seed stage that they can have all the people in place. They just don't have the money to do that. So what we're looking for when they come to us is that, do they have a clinical advisory board, which a lot of them do, and do they have a business advisory board, so that they at least have access to the smarts and the contents. And that tells us right away that person there knows the limitation. They're smart enough to basically get input from different people there. And if we know they're credible, it gives us a little bit of reassurance there that they have the right mindset, the flexible mindsets to hire the right people and complement themselves, as opposed to having all the answers.
So that's great answers. Thanks, guys. I want to move on and talk about some other topics here. We can get into more detail on some of these maybe in the Q&A later. But let's talk a little bit about some of these milestones. So I'm going to talk about milestones, maybe in a little bit about valuations now, but milestones in particular. So we've talked a little bit already about having the right milestones. So why don't we, and I know they're going to be different in different sectors, but at that really early stage, Ann, I'm going to start with you again. What are some of the milestones that you expect an early stage company to hit in that seed stage, perhaps, if you're coming in then? And then we can talk about A and B, perhaps, or maybe even does the terminology even matter, Ann, about what that is? But what are some of those early milestones that you look for, or is it specific to every single deal?
So they're different depending on the sector. So I'm going to differentiate medical device and health tech. In health tech, it's all about the business models. Who's going to pay and why? And so really understanding the workflow and all of that. So getting the company who has some early traction there, so we can do a pilot or a validation that their assumption on the business models there will work. And that's acquiring the customers, retaining it, changing the behavior, and getting somebody else to pay for it, and what are they looking for. So it's really understanding what's the cookie cutter, and what you need to show in the cookie cutter to get the next big round to scale it up, because people scale up way too quickly. In the traditional medical devices, you don't go to market because you can't. The FDA won't allow you to do that. So the big milestones there is that, can you have a discussion with the FDA? What are the metrics the FDA will measure you on? Are you a 510K with clinicals or PMA? What are you? And what are the metrics? And what will it take? Is it going to be 500 patients to get you there, or 10? So really understanding, in the funding, what will it take to get to the Series A? And at that stage, is the product works and the regulatory are the big milestones. And then we can supplement the technology and then the team, for the strategy. But so very two different look.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, let me go to you. Are there different things that you're looking for in terms of the milestones that the company can accomplish or has accomplished in this stage for your investment?
I think it's a little bit different look for us, and I kind of mentioned it earlier. So the first look has to be, what is the strategic fit back to the core, right? Is it early stage technology development? Then obviously we're looking at de-risking the technology, right? In our due diligence exercises, Do we get to play with the technology? Do we put some of our smart people in together with the entrepreneurs and work on some initial collaboration? Obviously creates some conflicts at times because there's IP creation potentially, and how do you allocate rights and things like that. So we have to be really mindful there. And then again, in the later stage, Dexcom was a PMA product for years and years. We're class 2 now. So 510K versus PMA doesn't scare us. We would, a lot of folks will be scared away by a PMA product. Frankly, it created a significant moat for Dexcom for years because it's such a high barrier to entry. And that actually dovetails into one of the things we think about pretty significantly is how can we be value-added investors? It's not just what's the strategic fit of the company back to Dexcom, but what value could we add? And there's really a spectrum there because, again, if it's true IP development, that becomes a little dicey, particularly as it starts to seep into kind of the core. If it's glucose related or insulin related technologies, that can really seep into the core, and we have to be really careful not to muddy the waters there. But if it's something that's, let's call it a different analyte that we would be sensing, but we can leverage the hundreds of millions of dollars that we put into R&D over the years to help them learn how to insert it or how to stick it to the body if it's a sensor. Things that are proprietary to us, but that we can actually help accelerate development for a portfolio company by leveraging, some of the assets that are important to Dexcom, but not like our secret sauce kind of thing. I think that's the kind of thing that we look at when we're evaluating this. Like really, it's kind of strategic on both parts. Can we don't want to be, I think Tom said it, dumb money. We want to be strategic and actually be able to help. We're not typically, especially as these valuations and the size of the rounds have grown, we're not a significant contributor in terms of dollars. We're probably up to maybe, $3 to $5 million in any given round. So we're probably not moving the needle in terms of the overall capital that a company is raising, maybe more so in the earlier stages, but in the later stages, we're certainly the companies that want us on their balance sheet simply because of the strategic aspects of it, whether it's we help validate them, we're bringing technology to the table, we're bringing clinical regulatory support. We've got all kinds of resources within Dexcom that we can leverage. So it's a little bit different model than I would tell you what a traditional VC would bring to the table.
Last question on Milestones, also in terms of risk, because we're talking about risk a little bit right now. So regulatory has always been the one, I think, historically that people looked at. Oh, we got to get FDA approval, we got to get regulatory approval, whatever the territory is, CE marking, etc. But regulatory approval was always a thing, and then everyone will figure everything else out later. That's someone else's problem. But I don't feel like that's the case anymore. I feel like payment has become a big risk for most people. So would you agree with that? When you think about risks, ultimately, what are the biggest risks that you're assessing? And I'll start with Tom on this one.
Yeah, no, Paul, I think you hit it on the head, right? The term used to be, right, you were scared of the 2 R's, regulatory and reimbursement. And I think things have flipped. I think the regulatory R is much smaller than the reimbursement R is. That doesn't mean the agency is always predictable, but I think the FDA is more predictable than they were in the past. Doesn't mean it's easy to get through, but I think with the right team and the right advisor, right, the right technologies do get through. It's hard to break the timeline. I think the bigger issue for us, at least across the domains in which we invest, and that's the domains we're talking about today, I think reimbursements become the big issue. When I say that, it's even more than classical reimbursement. And I'm going to steal Ann's line. It was so great. Who's paying, right? Because, you look in the world, and I'll go back to med device, the ability to get good payments and reimbursement is exceedingly tough. And so when you ask about looking at a team, I think one of the big things that we do when we evaluate teams is, can they really get to that hurdle, right? They may, two things. They may underestimate the reimbursement risk, and that gives us great pause, right? If they don't see that as a hurdle that's extremely high, or the regulatory risk, that's a concern, and they need some help with that. But the other thing that I think is exceedingly important is that they have a plan. You don't have to have the answer to reimbursement, but we have to be really comfortable that you have a plan that isn't something that seems too simple. I think the thing that regulatory and reimbursement that gives us pause about a team is the hand wave where we've got this, right? I think there's enough variability in both regulatory and reimbursement that's probably not the right answer, even from a serial entrepreneur. It's a matter of, we have a plan, and we're able to be flexible as we move forward. But I would say I wake up more nights worried about reimbursement in our portfolio than I do about regulatory.
And I think if I could expand, Paul, I mean, Tom is saying all the right things if it's a traditional medical device that needs a code. I'd like to expand this to say, what is the value proposition that justifies the buyer to basically pay for this? And in all of the cases in traditional health tech, there may not be a code because you're under DRGs or you're not a true medical devices, but you're selling to providers. So you have to talk about the workflow. We just talked to a company on Tuesday there, and they said, oh, we just get rid of the tech. And I said, that's not the way the hospital looks at things. Saving 15 minutes of a tech is not going to pay for your device. And so really understanding what is the value, what's the return on investment for someone who's going to pay for your products, how does it fit in the existing workflow, is the make and break. And I think I totally agree with Tom. FDA can be scary at times and unpredictable, but what makes or breaks is that can you get somebody to pay for your product in a way that it can scale up, where your cost of selling, which is still pretty high to the providers, can justify what you get out of it and what do you have to prove. And when we look at the seed level, we say, what will it take for you to show your business model is going to work? And if it's going to be 5,000 patients there that the hospital has to do and all of that, good luck, get Dexcom to pay for it. Sorry, Steve. But if it is something there where you can get a Stanford and a Mass General there that can do a deployment there, and you can measure the metrics that you're saving length of stays or you're making the process faster, whatever is the metrics. And very often the entrepreneur in the early stage cannot articulate that yet.
Yeah, I think that's right there. I mean, to summarize that, I think, I'm putting my Dexcom hat, not just my Dexcom Ventures hat. I think we found over the last several years that economic outcomes data has become as important, if not more important, than your clinical outcomes data to support your FDA filing. That great, you can get to a product that if it's not disruptive from a price perspective, and you can't prove that you're saving the system money, there's no more dollars in the system. Right, they're not going to pay more for, like you mentioned, to replace a tech. That's not the way it works. You need to show that you're saving costs to the payer, or you're dead on arrival.
And I want to accentuate that, because Steve, I agree with you and completely. And having been on the buyer side, on the health system side, I think that one of the things that we've seen more and more on the health tech side is people do great healthcare economic analyses, but it's from their perspective, not from the buyer perspective. And I don't think that people do enough customer discovery, right? The old fashioned, ICOR and other customer discovery, to really talk to the chief nursing officer, the chief medical officer at multiple systems to say, if you save, this is the classic point that was made, I'm going to have one less tech and you're going to be able to do one more procedure in a day. Well, the answer is the doc may want to do that, but can the nurses and everyone actually pull off one more procedure? So if your whole basis is one more colonoscopy per unit time, it's probably not going to happen. And if you talk to most chief medical officers, chief nursing officers, they know that. That's not going to be compelling to them. Yeah. Something else in their bag of tricks has to be achieved in order for it to be important. So I would say on the reimbursement side, there's lots of great advisors, but I think one of the key advisors is talking to the people who are actually going to write the checks, and talking to lots of them in a very customer discovery way, because you'll even see in large integrated delivery networks, them behaving completely different from their peers. And so it becomes a much more specialized sale. And of course, you've got to try to split the difference. But I just want to overemphasize intentionally that even the world's greatest healthcare economic analysis on paper may not mean anything to the buyers if you do it from the wrong perspective. So I think that's a key.
And it's I know you want to comment on this. These have been great comments. We only have 10 minutes left in the live broadcast, and I want to hit a couple other topics. We have a lot of discussions about value and and how to deal with value economics and what we've covered those in other webinars. We'll be covering them in ones that are coming up too. So I want to move us on to a couple of things really quickly here. Red flags. So this is something we talked a lot about in our prep call, and I know all of us have lots of horror stories and lots of battle scars that we can talk about potentially. So I would just kind of quickly like to just get a little bit of some thoughts from you on red flags. what are the things, I think someone put it in the pre-call, the thing that an entrepreneur can do in the first 10 minutes to ensure that you will never invest in that. What are some of the real red flags for each of you? I'll start off with Ann on this.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think the worst is that a CEO has to sell. And so when they come into the meeting and the first thing they tell me is to say, well, what is your company doing? They have not done their homework. They have no idea who we are. They have no idea who I am. And so for me, that's such a red flag, because that means you are basically self-centered. You haven't even made the 5 minutes efforts to go on my website, which has a lot of information. That's and remember, you lose us in the first 3 minutes. If you don't get my attention in the first 3 minutes, I don't pay attention to the rest. So I'm giving you my time. At least make an effort to be prepared for it and know why you're talking to me.
Great red flag. All right, Tom.
And just stole the one that drives me the most nuts. But I think it's important because it resonates completely. I'll add the second thing, which is, in that first 3 minutes, I think we tell a lot about the team, and we're not looking to invest in the smartest person in the room. We want a very earnest, smart person, but I think we want to invest in a human being who really is thoughtful about what they do. And so I think there's a fine line between overselling oneself for their technology and doing it in a way that can really turn folks off. And I think that's an important need, which is to know your audience, as Ann just outlined, but also to be really comfortable in your own shoes, right? Don't watch too much Shark Tank. Come in and tell us why I want to make an investment and work side by side with you for the next 8 years, of which at least 2 of them are going to be really rough. And that's important, right? We're backing the human being along with the story and the technology. So I think in a diligence process, who you are is going to show up. So better show up day one being yourself than being something that you can't maintain.
Yeah, the fine line I look for, I think there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance, right? And I think it's interesting when Tom, you're sitting in the middle of the country and you're saying you're not always investing on the coast. I get that. You tend to find on the coast, there's a level of arrogance sometimes. It's just a turnoff. So you got to be, I think we've belabored this point enough, but I think everybody listening probably understands what we're talking about.
Yeah, indeed. Team is, ultimately, what people are betting on, because if it's just a technology, maybe there's a license or something, but you got to have a team to execute. So team is so critical. And it's the reason that MedTech Innovator accepts companies only after we've gone through a whole process, including the companies pitching us in person, whether virtually or literally in person, but going through multiple rounds of that, because if we just read what was on the paper, it certainly is not going to represent the individuals, and we want to work with people we want to work with as well. And ultimately, that's a big part of this too. And people who want to be, as you said, people who've taken the time to get to know you and have prepared and understand the value that you can add and aren't just looking for dumb money, as Steve put it earlier. And so let's talk about money and dumb money briefly here, because these companies are started at very early stages, and the first people who put in money are friends and family, the founders themselves, and they have lots of ways of doing that. What are some things they can do to really screw things up for you, to make it so that you cannot make an investment? I know there's different things like setting the wrong valuation. We've talked about already. Making the valuation too high could be a problem. What are some other things that at that very early stage you've seen that makes it so you can't invest in something? Anyone want to comment?
One thing I despise is when I get an early stage presentation that talks about the exit valuation. When they tell me what they're going to exit at, I'm like, you don't know. You have no clue, especially when it's like a technology development stage company, right? They have no idea what, we're going to figure out a valuation to invest at, but they have no idea what the exit's going to look like, nor do they have any idea what the market's going to look like 3 or 5 or 8 years from now. So that kind of frustrates me when I'm like, that borders on that arrogance, right? You don't know that you're going to make this a 5X for your investors, for your early stage investors. You have no clue.
Yeah, I find it's a pretty common thing for people to do at that very, very early stage to say, hey, we think this could exit for 10X or 12X or whatever. But when they get to you, when they get to institutional investors or VCs, angels, I think they're past that stage.
Let us build the model and we'll tell you what we think it's going to exit at some point down the road.
Right. And so is it fair to say that valuation is something that you arrive at collaboratively, your companies? You don't expect them to show up and say, our valuation is this, or if you're going to be leading. Obviously, if you're following.
Yeah,
someone
again,
else.
for me, it's that's not usually an issue because I'm not typically in a lead position. So I let the more traditional folks beat up the company a little bit.
Well, Tom, you're more probably in that lead position. So do you set the valuation? Does the company come in and tell you the valuation?
Yeah, a huge turnoff for the company to come in and say, here's what I'm expecting for evaluation. It just it's wasted airspace, right? It's a negotiation, but it's really the buyers that are going to make that decision, which is we as the investors. And so I think that's really important. Now, if somebody says, we think we're similar to a company and they had this valuation, but I think walking in is a real challenge. I think the other one is the uncertain fundraise. We're going to raise between 10 and 23. Right? That's a completely different place.
What are you going to do with it?
World, exactly. So I think it's important that there is crispness and specificity without being overly tough. But to your point, Paul, I think one of the other things that folks do is in early stage, whatever the vehicle they use, right? Convertible notes, safe or otherwise, they hardwire things that are unrealistic, whether that be on the cap side or otherwise. We're going to have to undo some of that. Preference stacks, that's, and I'll tell you, there's a certain point at which needing to undo previous mistakes can overwhelm and make somebody walk from a deal that they're on the edge for. So I would be thoughtful about always thinking, just like, I tell my kids with social media, before you do anything social media, think what people are going to think when they see this a year from now. When you think about your cap table, think about what they're going to think when the new people come in to invest and how you can explain. And sometimes you have to do unusual things, but there's got to be a good explanation for them other than I talked to someone who told us our cap should be $100 million.
Yeah. I'd like to add two things to that. One, when people submit to us, one of the questions we ask them in our procedure platform is, what's your valuation? It's not that we think it's the hard number, but it gives us an idea of the expectation. If the expectation are out of whack, like $40 to $100 million for a seed stage, we should say no, we don't even invite them. And so if something is in the range, then we'll talk. The other thing is that we are looking for people that want to partner with us, that they see us as an equal, so that if we take a risk and we have 80% chance of losing our money at a series seed, is that we are going to be rewarded for taking that risk if we bring them to the Tom and the Steve afterwards there. So if people come to us and then they're getting safe terms that are ridiculous, so we basically have no interest, no cap, no nothing, and just hope that it converts sometime. I tell them it's easier for me to burn the money and get it over with. At least I don't have the emotional lose. And so we're looking for people who understand that we are there for the journey. It's a long journey. It's typically 5 to 7 years for me to get an exit in my averages. So you cannot divorce me. I'm there. As soon as I invest, you can't get rid of me, And so we're looking for people who understand that it's I help you, you help me, and you basically share the value creation over time so that we are rewarded when we take the risk to go to the C, the A, the B. And not right now it's C1, C2, C3, whatever. They have no meanings anymore. So I think it's really sensing that partnership that we're looking for.
Yeah. Let me just quickly, because we only have a couple minutes left, safes. I know that you have some opinions on safes. So is there a place for safes? Do you encourage them, and when?
So the SAFE was created by the Y Combinator for the first 100K into the company, friends and family. They may not even be in a corporation. So it was a piece of paper that's an IOU, which is, if I ever raise money, I'll convert maybe. And unfortunately, because the market is upside down right now in demand versus supply, people are now doing a $6 million SAFE after another $4 million SAFE after a price round. It is pure insanity. And so what it's creating is antagonism between the investors and the entrepreneurs. And right now you could, for the same amount of money, do a note. And what's nice about the note is that you can do all the what if scenario at the time where we're friendly and no bad news has happened yet. The problem with the SAFE is that when things go bad and you don't meet your milestones, you have problems there, then it's very antagonistic. And none of these scenarios have been discussed, and it can get really ugly. Also, quick note, angel investors, when they invest in a SAFE, lose all their tax benefits. They cannot take the gain, the federal tax gain that gets eliminated if we hold the stock for 5 years. All of that is eliminated. And if we lose our money, we can't even take it as a tax loss. So you need to understand, for angel, it's the kiss of death to ask for a SAFE, at least in organized angels.
Interesting. All right. Well, it's a whole nother topic perhaps on deal structures. But just, reiterating, safes are good at the super early stage. And after that, do a convertible note where you can actually negotiate. If you just do a safe, I understand it's easy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. All right, so we're wrapping up here. I want to get some final concluding thoughts from everybody, and then we'll continue on in our Q&A with just the cohort. But for those on YouTube Live, let me just wrap up. I know there were some questions on YouTube. I appreciate you guys submitting those. People asked some questions about the kinds of returns that you're looking for, timelines, time horizons for liquidity. And we didn't have a lot of time to get into those, so I'm sorry about that, but I will ask those questions afterwards, and I'll put them into the comments on the YouTube channel. So we will get those questions answered for you. So read the comments on the video in the YouTube channel. So concluding thoughts, I'll start with Steve. Anything that when you reflect on this conversation you want to share, any other last tips or anything that you want to tell people? And should people reach out to you if they're interested in Dexcom?
Yeah, I mean, if you could come to me with with at least a straight face of a strategic initiative that would be, connected to Dexcom. It doesn't have to be glucose, doesn't have to be, CGM or diabetes necessarily, but at least within the realm of like it passes the straight face test that I could take it to, to our investment committee. It's something great. I'll comment real quick on the returns thing because I touched on it briefly, but for Dexcom Ventures, we're not as focused on, I don't have we're trying to hit a 3x or a 5x or something on in our fund. We're going to be measured on if I do a deal with a commercial stage entity and it yields $100 million of revenue for the core business in terms of new sensor sales, that's a home run, even if my investment doesn't turn into something, magical. So we look at it a little bit differently than kind of a traditional firm.
Great, thank you. Anne, including thoughts, anything you want to share?
Yeah, but I mean, I think it was great that the other panelists had similar experience at different stages. So I think it looks like the entrepreneur needs to learn from, and then adjust and correct as they go to the next round of funding. For us, it's impossible to tell what the returns are. We're so early there. I mean, somebody says it's going to be a 20x in 3 years. It's incredible. We don't believe it. My personal experience, and I got lucky, is that I got 8 IPOs and multi-billion dollars exit. I could never predict at the time because they all had near-death experience multiple times. And so the journey is a huge roller coaster there. And so we're early in the journey. We're part of you. We're going to lift you up when you're at the bottom. We're going to bring you back down when you're manic. And then, and hopefully, some of them will exit.
Good comments, Anne. And people can find you at Health Tech Capital. Is it .com or
healthtechcapital.com? Yeah.
Okay. And Tom, concluding.
No, I think my colleagues in the panel have made the right comments. I think, Anne, I just want to accentuate it for those of you. Being an entrepreneur is hard, right? It's very, very challenging. It's a long road. And nobody does it by themselves, and even a founding team doesn't do it by themselves. So I think when you're making your decisions around investors, think about the long term, because I'll tell you, when you diligence your investors, the real key question to ask of people they've backed before are, what are they like in the downtimes? As Anne just said, there are going to be downtimes. I think everybody can be happy when things are euphoric. It's what happens in the downtime. I mean, the big analogy of this is, right, I've seen this happen with tech investors come into health tech who are not healthcare folks, and they want to know why your AR hasn't doubled, month over month over the last 4 quarters. Well, because it's healthcare and it's different. And so I think it's really important who you make your relationships with, just like in life, is a big deal. And so I think as we talk about money and valuations, it's check the ego at the door. And if you build a big enough pie in the partnerships you're in, it's going to be a good outcome for everybody involved, most importantly, your management team and everyone else. But I think it's important that, as Anne said, have the conversations up front when everybody's happy, and then learn what it's like to work with the folks you're going to work with when things go south, because every one of our companies, that the term near-death experience resonates very much with me. That happens a lot. And that's where I think both parties, the team and the board, that's where they earn their money and their wealth, is how do you manage those moments. So that's just my closing set of thoughts.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's just at arboretumvc.com. Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right. Yep. Thank you, Paul.
And Steve, how about you? Is there a Dexcom Ventures website?
There is one in creation or in development. So it's not available yet. You can always reach me just at spacelli@dexcom.com.
That's spacelli@dexcom.com. All right, great. Thank you, panel, for this first hour. We're going to stick around for the last 30 minutes with our private Q&A with the cohort. But for those of you on YouTube Live, thanks for joining us. Next week, we're going to be talking about exits and M&A. And so it's a good follow-up to today's discussion. We'll also be referencing the Silicon Valley Bank data that just came out. So Google that as well, and you can read that report in advance. We'll also have it posted on our website. So thanks everyone on YouTube. We'll look forward to seeing all of you again soon. And for everyone else,